All right, so let's dive into all this news around this proposed ceasefire in the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Yeah,
You sent over some really, really timely articles,
absolutely.
breaking news, in-depth analysis, even some stuff from Putin himself, and it feels like things are changing like every hour.
Yeah, I mean, it is an incredibly fluid situation.
Yeah.
And every statement, every move, on the geopolitical chessboard right now
Yeah.
carries so much weight.
Oh, for sure. So I guess our mission today is to try to,
Yeah, exactly.
make sense of it all.
Absolutely.
What is Putin really thinking with this ceasefire? What's
Yeah.
the U.S. response, and how are all these other global players reacting?
Yeah, exactly. We're going to try to connect those dots and look past the headlines and see what this means, for the future of this conflict.
Okay, one of the first things that stood out to me in all of this was Putin, in a recent press conference, starts by expressing gratitude to Donald Trump and India's Prime Minister Modi.
Yeah.
It felt kind of jarring considering like everything else that's going on.
It is a curious tactic on the surface. It might seem like a gesture of goodwill, but when you look a little deeper, this could be a move to exploit existing tensions between the U.S. and its allies.
So you're saying it's more about like driving a wedge than genuine appreciation?
It's possible. By publicly aligning himself with Trump and Modi, even with a simple thank you, Putin's creating a pressure point. It forces the U.S. to consider the fallout with partners like India if they push too hard against Russia.
That makes sense. Especially with Modi's stance. He's been advocating for peace, but he hasn't explicitly condemned Russia's actions.
Right. India has a long-standing relationship with Russia economically and militarily. They rely on Russia for things like arms imports. So for Modi, outright condemnation would have very serious consequences.
So what does this tell us about Putin's intentions then? Is he genuinely looking for a peaceful resolution here, or is this just another tactic to, gain some kind of advantage?
Well, if we look at his actions along with his words, a clearer picture starts to emerge. Take the proposed 30-day ceasefire, for example.
Okay.
He calls the idea correct, which initially seems promising, but then immediately follows that up with a list of nuances and serious questions.
And one of those questions was wanting to call Donald Trump directly.
Yes.
To discuss the ceasefire.
Right.
That really stood out to me.
It did to me as well. That suggests that he might be trying to circumvent traditional diplomatic channels and engage directly with someone that he perceives as more amenable to his demands.
So you're saying that Putin might be using this whole ceasefire proposal to buy time, so discord among his opponents, and potentially, negotiate a deal that is just better for him?
It is certainly a possibility, and we have to consider the historical context here. Russia has unfortunately broken ceasefire agreements in the past. In Chechnya, for example, they used a ceasefire to regroup and ultimately achieved a military victory.
So this gratitude, the specific conditions around the ceasefire, the direct line to Trump, it all paints a picture of someone who's being very careful and calculating.
Precisely. It's like a high-stakes poker game, and right now Putin is holding a lot of the cards, but the other players at the table are making moves as well.
And I imagine understanding those moves is key to, figuring out what happens next.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's talk about those other players, especially the U.S. They've been a huge force in shaping the response to this conflict. What's their take on everything?
Well, Trump's public statements have been interesting. He's calling Putin's recent actions promising but not complete, which kind of signals this cautious optimism while also keeping the pressure on Russia.
Yeah, that seems to be like his style. But what are they actually doing, though? Is it all just talk, or are there, real consequences for Russia if they don't, go along with things?
It's definitely not just talk. Those sanctions we talked about earlier are a big deal. They can really hurt Russia's economy and limit how they can fight this war. But at the same time, the U.S. is also trying to use diplomacy. They sent Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, to Moscow for direct talks.
So it's like a two-pronged approach: pressure with the sanctions and also a willingness to negotiate. But one of the articles you sent said some experts are kind of skeptical about Trump being able to actually negotiate with someone like Putin. They say he's too unpredictable and, easily swayed.
Yeah, that's a valid concern. Putin is a master strategist. He's known for exploiting weaknesses and manipulating situations to his advantage. Trump, on the other hand, is a little more impulsive and has a less conventional approach to diplomacy.
So there's this tension, right? The U.S. wants a peaceful resolution. They're sending envoys. They're talking about sanctions. But there's this worry about whether they can really outmaneuver Putin.
For sure. And it's not just about the U.S. and Russia. This whole conflict has sparked anxieties all over the world. especially in the countries that border Russia.
Yeah, a good example is Poland's recent request to have U.S. nuclear weapons stationed on their territory. That's a big move.
Yeah, it really shows just how much fear and uncertainty this conflict has created.
Mm.
Poland has experienced Russian aggression before, so they're looking for some serious security guarantees.
But wouldn't something like that just make things worse? Wouldn't it provoke Russia and maybe even push us closer to a bigger conflict?
It's definitely a gamble. There's this idea in international relations called deterrence theory, which says that if you have a believable threat of retaliation, even a nuclear one, it can actually prevent conflict. The idea is that nobody who's thinking clearly would risk an attack if it meant their own destruction.
So Poland's basically betting that if they have those U.S. nuclear weapons, they'll be less of a target for Russia.
Exactly. They're basically saying if you attack us, you're attacking the U.S., and that would be really bad. But of course, there's always a chance it could backfire and start the very conflict they're trying to avoid.
It's like a high-stakes game of chicken. And it really highlights all these complex alliances and rivalries that this conflict has brought to the surface.
Yeah, it's a reminder that what happens in one place can have consequences that spread way beyond. And that's especially true in a conflict like this where so much is at stake.
And while all this is going on, it's easy to forget about the people whose lives are being directly affected by the fighting.
Absolutely. It's so important to remember that for millions of Ukrainians who are caught in this whole situation, these negotiations and power plays feel very far removed from the violence and the loss that they're experiencing every day.
You know, we've heard from some of those voices in the articles you sent. One that really stuck with me was a resident of Mykolaiv, a city that's seen some of the worst fighting. He was deeply skeptical about the ceasefire, about Trump being involved, about whether anyone really cares about what happens to Ukraine.
That's a feeling that a lot of Ukrainians share. They've seen their homes destroyed, their families hurt or killed. They've seen the worst of war. So it's completely understandable that they don't trust political promises and diplomatic talk.
And Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, even though he agreed to the ceasefire, he seems to share some of that wariness. He knows what Russia has done in the past when it comes to keeping agreements. He's not naive to how this could all go wrong.
He's in a tough spot. He has to balance hoping for peace with the very real possibility that the fighting will continue. He has to deal with all the complexities of international diplomacy while also representing the needs and fears of his people.
So for Zelensky, this ceasefire is a real balancing act. He needs to project strength and determination while also being open to negotiating a solution.
Exactly. And he's doing all this under immense pressure, knowing that every decision he makes could determine whether people live or die in his country.
So we have Putin making these carefully calculated moves, the U.S. trying to apply pressure while also being open to diplomacy. Poland taking drastic steps to protect itself, and Zelensky right in the middle trying to find a way forward for his people. It's a complicated situation that's changing all the time, isn't it?
Yeah.
It really is.
It feels like we're watching, a really important moment, not just for Ukraine, but for the whole world.
I agree. The decisions that are made in the next few days and weeks could completely change the future of global security. So where does this all leave us then? We have Putin kind of cautiously accepting the ceasefire, but with a bunch of conditions. A direct line to Trump being one of them. And then you have these global ripple effects, like what's happening in Poland with their request for nuclear weapons. It really shows how much anxiety this conflict is causing.
And we can't forget about the human side of it.
Yeah.
Those stories from people in Ukraine, the weight of the decisions that Zelensky's making. It's a powerful reminder that beyond all the political stuff, there are real people whose lives are on the line.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about, honestly. And I'm sure our listeners trying to make sense of it all, too. So what are the main things we should take away from this? What should we be watching for as this all unfolds?
I think the most important thing is to remember that this is a really fluid situation. There aren't any easy answers. Nothing's guaranteed. Anything any of these players does could change everything.
So we need to stay informed and be ready for anything.
Exactly. And I think it's important to be aware of the different stories that are being told. Russia, the U.S., Ukraine, even countries like Poland and India, they all have their own goals, their own ways of seeing things.
So we need to be careful, think critically, question what we're hearing, and try to understand why people are doing what they're doing.
Absolutely. And don't forget about the power of those personal stories. The voices from Ukraine talking about their fear, their doubts, their strength, give us a perspective that's often missing from the big picture of geopolitics.
It's a reminder that this conflict isn't just about politics. It's about real people whose lives are being changed in huge ways.
Exactly. And those stories are important.
So we've talked about a lot. Putin's goals, the U.S. response, the global impact, the human cost of this war, what's the one thing you'd want our listener to walk away with? That one key insight to think about as we try to figure out what's going on?
I would say pay attention to the little things, the subtle ways people use language, the unexpected partnerships, the small gestures. Often those are the things that show us the real intentions and the potential consequences of what's happening on the world stage.
That's great advice. And I think it really sums up what this whole deep dive is about. It's about looking deeper, connecting the dots, and trying to understand the forces that are shaping our world.
It's about recognizing that even when things feel chaotic and unpredictable, there are patterns, motivations, and consequences. And if we understand those things, we can better deal with the complex times we're living in.
Well said. Thanks for walking us through this deep dive. It's been insightful and thought-provoking, and, to be honest, a little scary. But that's the world we live in.
It's been a great discussion. And to our listeners, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. The world needs more people who are willing to dive deep and wrestle with these tough issues.